Its fingers were coming through the glass. I watched in absolute horror as the mirror rippled like water, like liquid silver bending against the laws of physics, and those hands, my hands but twisted and wrong and ice cold, pushed through the surface reaching directly for my throat. I screamed, but no sound came out. My voice had abandoned me in the moment I needed it most. The bedroom that had been my sanctuary for 27 years had become a prison, a cage, a doorway to something I cannot describe without my hands shaking even now as I tell you this story. I could feel death, not the idea of death, not the fear of death, but death itself, a presence so heavy and so hungry that it pressed against my chest and squeezed the air from my lungs. The reflection that wore my face smiled at me with teeth that were too sharp, too many, a grin that stretched beyond what any human mouth should allow. And I knew, in that fraction of a second, that if those fingers wrapped around my neck, I would never wake up again. Not in this world. Not in any world where light still existed. But I am still here. I survived that night. And what saved me will change everything you think you know about the spiritual world, about the darkness that lurks just beyond what we can see, and about the power of a single desperate prayer spoken from the depths of absolute terror. Stay with me through this entire story, because what I am about to tell you might save your life, might save your soul, might be the very warning you need before the same darkness finds its way to you. My name is Bella. I was a 27-year-old accountant living alone in a small apartment in the suburbs, the kind of life that looks perfectly ordinary from the outside, the kind of life where nothing supernatural should ever happen. I went to work, I paid my bills, I called my mother on Sundays, and I slept in the same bedroom with the same antique mirror that had been passed down through 3 generations of my family. That mirror had hung on my wall for 6 years without incident. 6 years of reflecting my morning routine, my tired evenings, my ordinary life, until it woke up. I need to take you back to the beginning, to the first whisper, to the first moment when I felt that cold finger of dread trace down my spine and knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. It started 3 months before that night of horror, 3 months of slowly building terror that I tried to explain away, tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself was nothing more than stress and imagination and too many late nights at the office. I remember the exact date because it was the night after my grandmother's death anniversary. March 15th. I had spent the evening looking through old photographs, crying over memories of the woman who had raised me when my parents were too busy fighting each other to notice the little girl caught in the crossfire. My grandmother had been my shelter, my protector, my proof that love existed in a world that often felt cold and cruel. The mirror had been hers, a beautiful antique with an ornate gold frame carved with roses and thorns, and when she passed, it was the one thing I asked to keep. I thought having it in my room would make me feel closer to her. That night, I fell asleep with tears still drying on my cheeks, exhausted from grief and memory. I do not know what time it was when I woke, only that the room was dark and cold and something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in a way I could not immediately identify. I lay there in my bed, heart beginning to pound, eyes straining against the darkness, trying to understand why every nerve in my body was suddenly screaming at me to run. And then I heard it, my own voice, whispering my name from across the room. Bella. Just that, just my name, spoken in my exact voice, with my exact inflection, coming from the direction of the mirror. I sat up so fast my head spun, my hands gripping the sheets, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. The room was empty. The door was closed. The window was locked. There was no one there, no intruder, no explanation for what I had just heard. I told myself I had dreamed it. I told myself it was the residue of grief playing tricks on my exhausted mind. I told myself a dozen lies that night and eventually forced myself to lie back down, to close my eyes, to pretend that nothing had happened. But I did not sleep. I lay there until morning with my eyes squeezed shut, too afraid to look at the mirror, feeling watched in a way I had never felt before. The next day, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Almost. I went to work. I filed reports. I made small talk with coworkers about weekend plans and the weather, and I pushed the whisper to the back of my mind where uncomfortable things go to be forgotten. But that night, it happened again. Bella, clearer this time, closer. I was awake when it happened, lying in bed with a book I could not concentrate on, and there was no possibility of mistaking it for a dream. My own voice called my name from the mirror, and when I looked up, when I forced my terrified eyes to look at that glass surface, I saw my reflection staring back at me, but I was not moving. My hands were holding the book. My body was propped against the pillows. My reflection should have been showing exactly what I was doing, but instead, it was simply staring, staring at me with my own eyes, except there was something different about them, something I could not name but could feel like ice water dripping down my spine. The reflection's head tilted slightly to the left, a curious movement, a predatory movement, and I had not moved at all. I screamed and threw the book across the room. It hit the mirror and clattered to the floor, and suddenly my reflection was normal again, moving when I moved, showing my terrified face with complete accuracy. I did not sleep that night either. I sat in the corner of my room farthest from the mirror, knees pulled to my chest, watching that glass surface until sunlight finally crept through my curtains and I could breathe again. I should have gotten rid of the mirror. I know that now. I knew it then, somewhere deep in my gut, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembers when humans huddled in caves and feared the darkness for very good reasons. But the mirror had been my grandmother's. It was one of my last connections to her, and I could not bring myself to throw away something so precious over what I desperately wanted to believe was my imagination. So I tried to rationalize. I researched sleep disorders and hypnagogic hallucinations and the psychological effects of grief. I told myself that I was simply processing my grandmother's death in unhealthy ways, that my mind was creating these experiences as some kind of misguided coping mechanism. I even made an appointment with a therapist, though I never ended up going because what was I supposed to say? That my mirror was talking to me, that my reflection was moving on its own. For a week, nothing happened. 7 days of peace that let me believe I had been right, that it had all been in my head, that I was going to be fine. I started sleeping again, tentatively at first, then more deeply as the nights passed without incident. I began to feel foolish for how frightened I had been. I even laughed about it with a friend, not telling her the real story, but making a joke about how sleep deprivation can make you see things. And then the mirror showed me something I had never told anyone. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my hair in front of the mirror as I had done thousands of times before, when my reflection leaned forward and whispered words that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. Remember what you did to the cat when you were 8 years old. No one knew about that. No one. I had never told a single soul about the afternoon when I was 8 years old and I found a stray cat in the backyard and I did something terrible, something I had blocked from my memory for years, something I still cannot bring myself to describe because the shame of it burns too hot. It was an accident, mostly. I was young and stupid and did not understand how fragile life could be, but I had buried that memory so deep that I had almost convinced myself it never happened. And now my reflection was speaking it aloud. I backed away from the mirror, hairbrush clattering from my numb fingers, and my reflection stayed exactly where it was. It did not back away with me. It stood there at the glass surface, pressed close, eyes locked on mine with an expression of pure malicious joy. "I know all your secrets," it said in my voice, but twisted, darker, like my voice filtered through something rotten. "I know every shameful thing you have ever done, every lie you have told, every dark thought you have tried to hide. I know you better than you know yourself, and I am going to show you exactly what you really are." I ran out of my bedroom, out of my apartment, and I spent that night in my car in a grocery store parking lot, shaking so hard I could not hold my phone steady enough to call anyone. Who would I call? Who would believe me? I was a rational person living in a rational world, and what was happening to me did not fit into any rational framework. In the morning, I made myself go back. I had to. My job was there, my life was there, everything I owned was there. I could not run away from my own apartment forever. But when I opened the bedroom door and looked at the mirror, It was just a mirror again, just glass and gold frame, reflecting my exhausted face with perfect accuracy. I covered it with a sheet. For 2 days that worked. I could not see the mirror, so I could not see my reflection doing things it should not do, and the whispers stopped. I started to hope that made covering it had somehow blocked whatever was happening, that maybe the nightmare was over. I even began to consider uncovering it, just to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. On the third night, the sheet fell off. I heard the soft sound of fabric sliding against the wall and hitting the floor, and I woke to find the mirror completely exposed, gleaming in the moonlight that streamed through my window. My reflection was already there, already watching, already smiling that terrible smile that was my face but not my expression. Did you really think a sheet would stop me, Bella? The voice no longer whispered. It spoke clearly, confidently, as if whatever was behind that glass had grown stronger during my denial. I could hear amusement in the words, cruelty, the tone of something playing with its food before the killing bite. I tried to cover the mirror again, but the sheet would not stay. Every time I draped it over the frame, it slid off as if the glass had become too smooth to hold fabric. I tried tape, I tried hanging it from the top of the frame, I tried pinning it to the wall around the mirror. Nothing worked. The sheet always fell, and my reflection always loft. The mirror could not be removed from the wall. I discovered this on the fourth night, when I decided to simply take the whole thing down and throw it in the dumpster, grandmother's memory or not. But the mirror was fastened to the wall with screws that would not turn, nails that would not budge, attachments I could not see or understand. I pulled and tugged and pried until my fingers bled, and the mirror did not move a single millimeter. It was fixed to my wall as if it had ground there, as if it had always been there, as if it was never going to leave. So you are starting to understand, my reflection said while I slumped on the floor, bleeding and defeated. You cannot run from me, you cannot hide from me. I am going to be right here, every night, until I get what I came for. I asked it what it wanted. My voice was hoarse and trembling, barely a whisper, but I had to know. What did this thing want from me? What could I possibly give it to make it go away? My reflection leaned closer to the glass, so close that if the mirror had been a window, we would have been nose to nose. Its eyes were my eyes, but darker, deeper, like looking into an abyss wearing my face. I want you, Bella, all of you, your fear, your hope, your memories, your soul. I want to wear your life like a coat while you take my place in here, in the cold dark behind the glass. I have been waiting so long for someone like you, someone so full of guilt and shame and secret pain. You called me when you cried over your grandmother. Your grief was like a beacon, and I followed it straight to you. Now you are mine, and nothing in your world can save you. I would like to tell you that I fought back. I would like to tell you that I was brave, that I refused to give in to fear, that I stood up and declared that I would not be victimized by this thing. But the truth is that I fell apart completely. I sobbed on the floor of my bedroom while my reflection watched with satisfaction, and I begged it to leave me alone, offered it anything it wanted if it would just go away. It laughed at me. It laughed with my voice, and the sound was the worst thing I had ever heard. Over the following weeks, my life became a waking nightmare. I could not sleep because every time I closed my eyes, I felt those dead eyes watching me from across the room. I could not eat because the constant terror destroyed my appetite. I began to look like a host myself, pale and thin and hollow-eyed, and my coworkers started to whisper concerns that I barely heard through the fog of exhaustion. The reflection grew bolder every night. It began to move around within the mirror, as if the glass were a window into another room, walking out of frame and returning from different angles. Sometimes I would look at the mirror and see nothing, just an empty bedroom reflected back at me, and then the reflection would suddenly appear right at the glass, face pressed against the surface, making me scream every single time. It knew things it could not possibly know. It recited conversations I had had years ago with people who were now dead or moved away. It reminded me of lies I had told in childhood, of embarrassments I had buried so deep I had genuinely forgotten them. It spoke about my first boyfriend, about the way things had ended, about the cruel things I had said that I regretted to this day. It took every ugly piece of my past and held them up like trophies, showing me exactly how well it knew the darkest corners of my soul. The objects in my room began to respond to it. This is when I knew, beyond any shadow of doubt, that I was not experiencing a mental breakdown. This is when the horror crossed over from psychological terror into something far more sinister. I was standing in front of my dresser one night, carefully avoiding looking at the mirror, when I saw my lamp flicker in my peripheral vision. I turned to look, and there was my reflection standing at the edge of the mirror with one hand raised. It moved its hand in a slow, deliberate gesture. The lamp flickered again, in perfect synchronization with the motion. "Watch what I can do now," the reflection said, and it swept its hand to the left. Every drawer in my dresser slid open at once. My clothes spilled out onto the floor. The picture frame on my nightstand toppled over. The curtains twitched as if touched by a wind that did not exist. "I am getting stronger, Bella. Every night you stay in this room, every night you feed me your fear, I grow a little more powerful. Soon I will be strong enough to reach right through this glass and take what I want." I tried to leave the room then. I tried to abandon the bedroom entirely, to sleep on my couch, to stay anywhere but near that mirror. But the apartment had only one bathroom, and it was attached to my bedroom. The only door was through that room. No matter how hard I tried to arrange my life around avoiding that space, I always had to go back, and whenever I did, the reflection was waiting. It started affecting my dreams too. Whenever I managed to fall asleep from sheer exhaustion, I would find myself in the mirror world, trapped behind cold glass, watching my reflection walk around my room, wearing my body. These nightmares were so vivid, so real, that I would wake up confused about which side of the mirror I was really on. I would stare at my hands for long minutes, pressing them against surfaces, making sure they were solid, making sure I was still in the real world. The reflection loved this confusion. It played games with me, sometimes moving exactly as I moved to make me doubt my own reality, then suddenly stopping or doing something different to remind me that it was not me, had never been me, was something else entirely. It sang songs from my childhood in my voice. It recited prayers my grandmother had taught me, but with the words twisted, darkened, turned into mockeries of faith. I tried to tell someone. I called my mother, but the words stuck in my throat. I went to see a priest, but I sat in the parking lot of the church for an hour and could not make myself go inside because the reflection had told me that morning that God had forgotten about me. I was too stained with sin to be saved, that divine protection was only for the pure, and I was anything but pure. I believed it. That is the worst part. I believed the lies it told me because it said them in my own voice, and somewhere deep inside I had always believed the worst about myself. The isolation was almost as bad as the terror. I stopped returning calls and texts. I called in sick to work so many times that my boss started hinting about attendance policies. I sat alone in my apartment, too scared to sleep, too exhausted to function, watching my reflection grew stronger and bolder and more solid behind the glass. One night, it pressed its hands against the mirror, and I saw the glass bend. That was not possible. Glass does not bend. Glass is rigid, inflexible. It breaks before it bends. But I watched with my own eyes as my reflection pushed against the surface, and the glass curved outward like plastic wrap, stretching toward me, bringing those hands closer to my side of reality. "I can almost reach you now," it said, and its voice was no longer coming from behind the glass. Its voice was in my room, in the air around me, surrounding me. "A few more nights, a few more doses of your delicious fear, and then you will take my place in the cold dark forever, and I will finally be free." The temperature in the room dropped so fast I could see my breath. Frost began to form on the window, on the walls, on everything except the mirror. The mirror stayed clear and bright, a portal of terror in the center of spreading ice. I could feel something pressing against my chest, an invisible weight, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. I want to stop here and speak directly to you, to whoever is watching this story right now. If you believe in Jesus, if you believe that there is a God who loves us and fights for us against the darkness, I need you to subscribe to this channel. I need you to do it right now before we go any further, because what I am about to tell you is the most important part of this story. This channel posts daily Jesus stories that change lives, and you need to hear them. The world is full of darkness like what I experienced, and the only defense against that darkness is faith. Subscribe now, and let us continue. The night everything changed was exactly 3 months after the first whisper. I had not slept more than a few hours in weeks. I had lost 15 pounds that I could not afford to lose. I jumped at every shadow and flinched at every reflection. I was dying slowly but certainly, being consumed by terror that never let up, never gave me a moment of peace, never let me forget for a single second that I was being hunted. That night, the reflection's hands came through the glass. I was sitting on my bed, too exhausted to even try to sleep, staring at nothing, when I heard a sound I will never forget. It was like ice cracking, like glass flexing, like reality itself being forced open. I looked at the mirror and saw my reflection pressed against the surface, grinning that terrible grin, and then its fingers pushed through. They emerged from the glass like hands emerging from water, smooth and slow and absolutely impossible. The mirror's surface rippled around them, bending and flexing in ways that made my mind scream with wrongness. The fingers were my fingers in shape, but wrong in every other way, pale as death, cold as winter, reaching toward me with deliberate, hungry purpose. I screamed. I finally screamed, a sound torn from somewhere deeper than my lungs, a sound of absolute primal terror that I did not know I was capable of making. I scrambled backward off the bed, crashing into my nightstand, sending the lamp flying. I hit the floor hard enough to bruise, but I did not feel the pain, could not feel anything except the overwhelming certainty that I was about to die. The hands kept coming, wrists now, then forearms, emerging from the rippling glass with slow, patient determination. The reflection's face was still pressed against the surface, watching me with my own eyes that gleamed with triumph and hunger. "You cannot run, Bella. There is nowhere to go. I have waited so long for this moment, and now you are finally mine." The room was so cold that my fingers were going numb. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, swallowing the light from the street lamp outside, creating a void that centered on the mirror and its emerging horror. I could feel something reaching into my chest, not physically but spiritually, something trying to grab hold of my very essence and pull. I was going to die. Not just die, but be taken, consumed, erased and replaced by this thing that wore my face. I would spend eternity trapped behind cold glass while it lived my life, touched my things, spoke with my voice to the people I loved. The thought was more horrifying than death itself. The hands were almost at my bed now. The arms had emerged up to the elbows, reaching across the distance between the mirror and where I cowered on the floor. In seconds, maybe less, they would reach me. They would close around my throat or my wrists or my face, and they would drag me into that dark, cold place from which there was no return. I did not think about what I did next. There was no conscious decision, no weighing of options, no rational analysis. There was only pure desperate instinct, a cry from the deepest part of my soul, a plea to the only power I could imagine that might be greater than the horror before me. I fell to my knees on the floor of my bedroom and I prayed. "God, please save me." I screamed the words with everything I had, every ounce of terror and desperation and faith I did not even know I still possessed. I screamed them at the ceiling, at the darkness, at whatever divine presence might be listening to the desperate plea of a broken woman facing her own destruction. And God answered. The light came from everywhere at once. It was not like any light I had ever seen before. It was not like sunlight or lamplight or firelight. It was warm and golden and somehow alive, filling the room instantly, completely, as if someone had flipped a switch and replaced the darkness with pure radiant peace. The cold vanished in an instant, replaced by warmth that seeped into my bones, and though the terror that had frozen my heart, the reflection froze. I watched as my mirror image stopped mid-reach, those horrible hands extended toward me, face twisted in a snarl of frustrated rage. For a moment, everything was still, the light and the darkness suspended in perfect opposition, the battle between forces far greater than myself playing out in my little bedroom. Then the reflection began to scream. It was not my voice anymore. It was something ancient and terrible and afraid, a sound of pure agony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The reflection's face contorted into expressions no human face could make, sickling through terror and rage and pain so fast I could barely process what I was seeing. The glass began to crack, lines spread across the mirror's surface like spider webs, starting from where the hands emerged and racing outward in all directions. The reflection tried to pull back, tried to retreat into the glass, but it was too late. The light was pressing in, pressing through, filling every crack and crevice with golden radiance that the darkness could not withstand. No, the reflection's voice was distorted now, losing its similarity to mine, revealing something older and darker beneath. Not like this. I was so close. I was so close it. The mirror exploded. But it did not explode outward like normal glass showed. It exploded inward, into itself, into whatever dark space had existed behind its surface. The hands vanished, the reflection vanished, the terrible presence that had haunted me for 3 months vanished, all of it pulled back into wherever it had come from by a force that dwarfed its own considerable power. For a long moment I stayed on my knees, trembling, unable to move or speak or think. The light remained, though it was gentler now, softer, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. The warmth in my bones was spreading through my whole body, thawing 3 months of accumulated terror, melting the ice that had formed around my heart. And then I heard a voice. Not my voice, not the reflection's twisted imitation. Something else entirely, something that seemed to come from the light itself, words that I felt as much as heard. You are safe now, beloved. The darkness could not hold you because you called upon my name. You were never forgotten, never abandoned, never too stained to be saved. You are precious to me, and no power in existence can take you from my hand. I wept. I wept like I had not wept since childhood, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. But these were not tears of terror. These were tears of relief so profound it was almost painful, tears of gratitude so overwhelming I could not contain it, tears of recognition that I had been saved from something far worse than physical death by a power far greater than I had ever truly believed in. The light faded slowly, gently, leaving me in ordinary darkness that no longer felt threatening. The mirror on my wall was just a mirror again, its surface whole and unmarked as if it had never cracked, as if the explosion had never happened. But the presence that had lived behind it was gone. I could feel its absence like the relief of a fever breaking, like the easing of pressure that had been building so long I had forgotten what its absence felt like. I stayed on my knees for a long time that night, praying, crying, thanking God for a salvation I had not earned and did not deserve. I thought about all the times I had doubted, all the times I had turned away from faith, all the times I had believed the lies the reflection told me about being too sinful to be saved. None of that had mattered in the moment of crisis. One desperate cry had been enough. The next morning, I woke up feeling rested for the first time in months. The sun was streaming through my window, and my bedroom looked completely ordinary, completely safe. The mirror reflected only what it showed: my face, my room, my morning light. I walked up to it slowly, cautiously, and pressed my hand against the cold glass. It was just glass, just a mirror. Whatever had lived behind it was gone, banished by a power infinitely greater than its own darkness. In the days and weeks that followed, I changed. How could I not? I had stared into the face of real evil, had felt the cold touch of something that wanted to consume my very soul, and I had been saved by the direct intervention of God. Everything I thought I knew about the world had been shattered and rebuilt in a single night of terror and miracle. I started going to church, not out of obligation or habit or social expectation, but out of genuine burning need to be close to the God who had saved me. I sat in the pews and listened to sermons with new ears, hearing truths I had heard before, but never really understood. I joined a small group and began to share my story, hesitantly at first, then more confidently as I found that others had experienced similar encounters with darkness and similar rescues by divine light. I got rid of the mirror, not because I was afraid of it anymore, but because I did not need it. I did not need anything that connected me to that time of terror and isolation. I packed it carefully and donated it to a church that had a ministry for cleansing and blessing objects that had been touched by darkness. I do not know what they did with it, but I trust that it is in good hands, that whatever lingering traces of evil it might have carried have been purified by the same light that saved me. My relationship with my mother improved. I had never realized how much I had been keeping her at arm's length, how many walls I had built between us because of childhood hurts and old resentments. The experience with the mirror had shown me how precious time was, how quickly life could be taken, how foolish it was to waste the love that was offered to me. I called her and told her I loved her, and she cried on the phone, and we began the slow work of rebuilding what had been broken. I went back to therapy, this time actually going through with it. I talked about the childhood trauma, about the guilt I carried, about all the dark corners of my psyche that the reflection had exploited. I learned that the shame I felt did not define me, that mistakes made in childhood could be forgiven, that I was not the monster the reflection had tried to convince me I was. I learned that darkness seeks out our weak points, our old wounds, and uses them as doorways. Healing those wounds is part of how we defend ourselves. Most importantly, I learned that I was never alone. That is the message I need you to hear. The lesson that 3 months of terror taught me at the cost of nearly everything I had: you are never alone. No matter how dark the night, no matter how cold the fear, no matter how convincing the voices that tell you God has forgotten about you, you are never alone. The light is always there, always waiting, always ready to answer the desperate cry of a soul in need. The darkness is real. I know that now in a way I never knew before. There are forces in this world that hunger for human souls, that lurk in the shadows and look for ways to reach into our lives and drag us into their cold embrace. They come through mirrors and dreams and whispers in the night. They come through depression and addiction and isolation. They come through any crack they can find, any wound we leave untreated, any door we leave opened. But the light is more real, and the light is stronger. I think about that night sometimes, when I am having a hard day or struggling with doubt or facing fears that feel overwhelming. I close my eyes and remember the warmth that filled my bedroom, the voice that spoke love directly into my heart, the absolute certainty I felt that I was precious and protected and claimed by a power no darkness could defeat. That memory sustains me. That experience changed everything. The mirror on my bathroom wall now is just a mirror. It reflects my face accurately, moves when I move, does exactly what mirrors are supposed to do. I am not afraid of mirrors anymore, though I understand them differently than I did before. They are boundaries, then places where the physical world meets something else. Most of the time, they are just glass and reflection. But sometimes, for some people, in some circumstances, they can become doorways. If you are experiencing something like what I experienced, if you are seeing things that should not be possible, hearing voices that should not exist, feeling watched by something that terrifies you beyond reason, I need you to know that there is hope. I need you to know that you are not crazy, and you are not alone, and you are not beyond saving. The same God who rescued me from the darkness behind my mirror is ready and willing to rescue you from whatever darkness is threatening your soul. You do not have to be perfect. You do not have to be free of sin or doubt or mistakes. You do not have to have all the answers or understand theology or even be sure that you really believe. All you have to do is cry out, honestly and desperately, and help will come. I am living proof of that truth. My name is Bella, and 3 months ago, I looked into a mirror and saw death reaching for me with my own hands. I felt the cold of something that wanted to drag me into eternal darkness. I heard voices that knew my deepest secrets and used them to convince me I was beyond hope. I was absolutely certain that I was going to be destroyed, but I prayed. In my darkest moment, with death's hands around my throat, I prayed, and God answered with light so powerful that the darkness shattered like the fragile thing it truly was. I am still here. I am alive. I am free. I am moved by a power greater than any evil could ever be. And so are you. Type amen in the comments if you believe in miracles. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more testimonies of divine intervention and spiritual truth. And remember, no matter how dark your night seems right now, the light is coming. Hold on. Pray, trust. God has not forgotten you. Amen.